My name is Lauren Chambers, and for most of my adult life I believed I had won some sort of cosmic lottery when I married my husband, Daniel. Everyone who knew him called him the calmest, kindest, most considerate man they had ever met. He had this gentle way of speaking, a warmth in his eyes that made people feel instantly safe. When we started dating, I remember thinking he looked like someone who stepped out of a romance novel, the type of man who carried grocery bags for strangers and brought flowers without needing a reason. My father, whose approval meant everything to me, took one look at Daniel and said he was a good one coming from my father, the man who built our family business from nothing and guarded everything in his life with both fists clenched. That blessing meant Daniel was as close to perfect as a son-in-law could be, so I didn't question anything. Not Daniel's past, not how quickly he moved into my life, not even how seamlessly he fit himself into every part of my routine. I just let myself be swept up in the comfort of it. When my father died suddenly from a heart attack last spring, my world cracked open in ways I didn't even know were possible. I wasn't ready to be without him. I wasn't ready to face the responsibilities he left behind. But Daniel stepped in immediately, too immediately. Now that I look back, he took over every errand, every phone call, every lawyer appointment. He insisted that I just focus on grieving while he handled the practical side of things. Everyone said I was lucky to have such a supportive husband. I repeated that to myself every time something about his eagerness made my stomach twist. But grief is blinding, and love makes you trust even when your instincts whisper that something is wrong. In the weeks after the funeral, Daniel became attentive in a way that felt almost mechanical. He brought me tea every morning, tucked me into bed every night, kept telling me how fragile I looked and how he needed to take care of everything so I wouldn't collapse under the weight of stress. I thought it was love. I thought this was what marriage was supposed to look like. What I didn't notice was how his attention was always accompanied by a pen, or a printer, or an envelope stamped with documents I didn't fully read because he assured me they were just routine estate adders. I signed papers because he stood beside me with that soft, soothing voice, telling me he had checked everything twice. I signed because I trusted him more than I trusted myself in that foggy, gray period. But grief eventually thins, and when the fog lifted, I began noticing the small cracks first. The emails he deleted before I could see them. The fact that he changed the passwords to my father's business accounts for security reasons. The long phone calls he silenced when I walked into the room. The way he grew irritated whenever I asked questions, but instantly softened his tone when he needed me to sign something. I remember the exact night everything began to shift. I woke up around 2 a.m. because Daniel wasn't in bed. He rarely stayed up late, so I walked downstairs thinking he had fallen asleep on the couch. Instead, I found him hunched over my father's old desk, illuminated by the blue glow of his laptop screen. The expression on his face wasn't grief. It wasn't fatigue. It was calculation sharp, focused, almost hungry. He didn't notice me right away, and in the second before he closed the laptop, I saw numbers, lists, something that looked suspiciously like property transfers. But when he turned and saw me, he smiled that soft smile again, kissed my forehead, and said he was just sorting through old files. I wanted to believe him. I did believe him until the day I received a letter in the mail with my signature on it. A signature I knew I never wrote. The letter was confirmation of a transfer of a significant portion of my father's estate into a trust with Daniel as the primary administrator. The trust had been created 2 months ago, 1 week after my father died. At first I panicked, thinking I had signed something unknowingly. But the signature wasn't just wrong, it was obviously forged. My father always taught me to look at details, and the details here screamed deception. I felt something icy crawl up my spine. That was the first time the idea crossed my mind that Daniel wasn't helping me manage my father's legacy, he was quietly taking it. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part came when I started digging through the computer logs on my father's old laptop. Daniel thought he had deleted everything, but he didn't understand that my father had installed automatic backups for safety. In those backups, I found emails between Daniel and a woman named Elise. At first I thought she was a coworker, maybe someone helping with estate paperwork. But the more I read, the more sick I felt. They weren't just close. They were intimate, secretive, coordinated. And the worst line in one email still echoes in my head. Once everything is transferred, things will get much easier. She won't be an obstacle. Not an obstacle. Not a wife. An obstacle. That was the moment the truth finally shattered through the illusion of my marriage. It wasn't love. It wasn't devotion. It was strategy. Daniel had married me for one reason: to get control of my inheritance. And according to those emails, he wasn't finished. He had plans. Plans that involved getting me out of the way. I stared at the screen with shaking hands, realizing that the man I slept beside every night wasn't just a liar, he was dangerous. And he wasn't done with whatever he had started. The moment I realized what Daniel had been hiding, something cold and electric snapped awake inside me. Fear, yes, but also a sharp clarity that cut through every layer of denial I had been clinging to for months. I kept scrolling through the emails, my pulse thundering, my breath shallow. Elise wasn't just someone he confided in. She was someone he planned with. Their messages stretched back even before my father died, back to the months when Daniel and I were still newlyweds. Elise was methodical, almost clinical in her phrasing. She asked for updates, instructed him on specific documents, and pushed him to move faster whenever I appeared hesitant. She even sent him templates, drafts of resignation letters, drafts of trust agreements, drafts of loan applications that would shift assets from my father's accounts into joint holdings Daniel could lat or dissolve. The thing that rattled me most was how she talked about me. Has she softened toward you yet? Does she still insist on reviewing documents? You can't afford to let her get suspicious. Every line was a reminder that I had been observed like prey, studied, analyzed, and evaluated for weaknesses. I closed the laptop only when my hands began trembling so violently that I worried I might drop it. For the first time since marrying Daniel, I was afraid to move, afraid he might hear me, afraid he might be watching even now. I quietly tiptoed upstairs to our bedroom, forced my breathing into something steady, and slipped into the covers just before I heard his footsteps on the stairs. When he walked in, everything in me went rigid. He looked at me with that practiced softness and whispered that he had stayed up late organizing financial statements again. I remember nodding, closing my eyes, pretending to drift off. But inside, I was memorizing how easily he could lie while looking directly at me. The next morning, I left the house before Daniel woke up. I told him I needed air, and he didn't question it. Maybe he thought he still had me fooled. Maybe he believed his charm was enough to smooth over any suspicion. My first stop was my father's lawyer, Mr. Ellison, a man my father trusted more than almost anyone. He had been gentle with me after the funeral, patient with my confusion, and careful with every document. When I walked into his office that morning, something in his expression changed. He asked if I was feeling better, if Daniel had taken care of the paperwork the way he promised. I remember sitting across from him, gripping the arms of the chair, and asking a single question. Did you approve the transfer into the Chambers Trust 2 months ago? His face drained of color. He turned to his files, flipped through papers, then shook his head. Lauren, he said slowly, I have not filed any trust documents on your behalf. Who told you I had? And that was when my fear turned into something sharper: proof. Undeniable, irreversible proof. I showed him the letter. He examined the signature, the notary stamp, the authorization line where his own name had been typed, then forged. He looked shaken and horrified. He told me the trust was real. The transfer had been executed legally, but none of it had come through him. Someone had hired another attorney, someone obscure, someone far outside our area to process the documents. Someone who had used my forged signature along with forged authorization from Ellison's office. In other words, Daniel had not only stolen my inheritance, he had done it in a way that would crumble the moment a deeper audit took place. He wasn't just stealing. He was preparing to close every door behind me so I couldn't undo it later. I asked Mr. Ellison if he could reverse it. He said not yet. Not without evidence. Not without triggering legal alarms that would alert Daniel and give him time to hide assets. He told me something else, something that made my skin crawl. Lauren, this kind of forgery isn't done by amateurs. Whoever is helping him, they know exactly how to manipulate legal blind spots. That confirmed it. Elise wasn't just a mistress. She was an accomplice, a strategist, a partner in the crime. I asked Ellison what I should do. He leaned forward and told me to act normal, to gather everything I could discreetly, to not confront Daniel until I had the full scope of what he was doing, and, most importantly, did not stay somewhere without witnesses. Those words sat heavy in my chest. Until that moment, I had assumed Daniel was manipulative, greedy, deceitful, but Mr. Ellison's warning implied something darker, something potentially violent. I drove home with my heart pounding, rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd behave, how I'd keep him from seeing the shift inside me. When I walked through the door, Daniel was in the kitchen making breakfast. He greeted me with that soft smile again, the one that once felt comforting but now felt like a mask stretched too tightly across secrets. He asked where I'd been. I told him I went for a walk. He didn't push, but his eyes lingered on me a second too long, as if he sensed something was off. Over the next week, I pretended to be the grieving wife he expected. I acted overwhelmed when he explained documents, nodded at his reassurances, let him believe I still trusted him. Meanwhile, every night after he fell asleep, I went through the house piece by piece. I checked drawers, folders, mail, pockets of coats, bank statements, hidden desktop folders. What I found painted a picture far worse than I imagined. Daniel had multiple accounts tied to properties I'd never heard of, investments under shell company names, insurance policies on me, several of them taken out just 2 months after we married. One policy labeled accidental death. My blood went cold every time I saw the phrase. Elise had helped him file the applications. Their emails spelled out timelines. Their messages detailed the order in which assets should be transferred and when a payout could be expected. Daniel wasn't planning to run away with my inheritance. He was planning to eliminate me once he had total control of it. The deeper I dug, the more certain I became. If I didn't move first, I wouldn't survive whatever came next. And yet the scariest part wasn't the documents. It was how good he was at pretending to love me. How easily he wrapped an arm round my waist while planning my disappearance. How gently he stroked my hair at night while calculating the financial benefit of my death. The final confirmation came the night I found a hidden folder in his office. Inside was a detailed checklist, labeled with a date that was only 3 weeks away, a date that had a single phrase beside it, final stage. I stared at the words final stage next to that date until the room around me blurred, until the edges of the paper seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my heartbeat. That single phrase carried a weight I felt in my bones because everything I had uncovered pointed in one direction. Daniel wasn't planning to divorce me or manipulate me into signing something catastrophic. He was planning to remove me entirely, to turn me into a tragic accident, and collect the money he had arranged so meticulously. I put the folder back exactly where I found it, ranging each sheet down to the millimeter because if he sensed even the slightest disturbance, my timeline would collapse. I left his office and walked upstairs like my skin wasn't crawling, like my stomach wasn't twisting, like I wasn't planning how to escape my own home. When I entered our bedroom, he was already in bed, smiling at me with that practiced warmth. It took everything inside me not to recoil when he reached for my waist. His hands felt like ice despite their warmth because now I knew those hands had shaped plans for my death while making me breakfast, had typed forged signatures while kissing my forehead, had caressed my cheek while coordinating timelines with Elise. I lay awake next to him for hours, my gaze fixed on the ceiling, calculating. I had 3 weeks. 3 weeks before whatever plan he and Elise crafted reached its final stage. I didn't know what the stage entailed, but I knew what the insurance policies implied. Accidental death. I thought of the new hiking trip he'd suggested recently, one I'd brushed off as too soon after the funeral. I thought of the weekend getaway he kept insisting on, a cabin near a steep cliff. I thought of the boating rental he mentioned offhandedly to a friend. Every suggestion suddenly transformed into a possible scenario designed to look tragic and random. I couldn't confront him. Not yet. Not until I had gathered enough evidence to destroy every version of the story he could spin. Not until I had someone who could protect me both legally and physically because I was now certain he was capable of anything if he felt cornered. But the worst part was knowing I had to keep pretending, keep smiling, keep playing the naive grieving widow he thought he controlled. The next morning I contacted Mr. Ellison again, telling him I needed a private meeting. He worked me into his schedule immediately. I told him everything I found, the policies, the forged documents, the shell companies, the checklist with the date. His expression shifted from concern to something heavier, something grim. He said he needed help from someone experienced in cases like this. He called a private investigator he trusted, a retired federal agent named Marlene Graves. She was sharp, direct, and didn't waste a second pretending to soften her words. She told me that people like Daniel were far more common than anyone wanted to believe. Men who targeted grieving heirs, widows, or wealthy daughters, married them quickly, earned their trust, then slowly drained them of everything before making their deaths look accidental. She told me the most dangerous stage was the one I was entering, the stage where the predator believes the end is close and can't risk delays. She said I needed to separate emotionally, detach completely, and be prepared to act before he did. Over the next week, Marlene dug into Daniel's past. What she uncovered made my stomach turn. Daniel had been married before. A woman named Rebecca, someone I had never heard of. She had died in a car accident 3 years before I met him. A single vehicle crash on a remote road late at night. Deemed accidental. But Marlene dug deeper. Rebecca had a life insurance policy, taken out 6 months before her death. A policy in Daniel's name, paid out quietly. When Marlene confronted the insurance agency's archived records, she discovered something chilling. A clause in the payout form with handwriting that looked eerily similar to what she saw on the forged documents in my father's estate. She told me the probability of coincidence was non-existent. My blood ran ice cold. I wasn't Daniel's first wealthy wife. I was his second. And if I didn't move carefully, I would meet the same end. Despite the terror clawing at my insides, I had to continue pretending nothing was wrong. At home, I played my role flawlessly. I let him cook dinner. I let him ask how I was feeling. I let him place his hand on the small of my back and guide me to the couch, even though every instinct in my body screamed to flinch away. I even acted touched when he surprised me with a weekend getaway reservation at that cabin near the cliffs. He said it was time for us to reset, to breathe, to reconnect. In reality, it was time for me to die. I told him it sounded lovely, that I needed the change of scenery. He kissed me gently, and I forced myself to smile back. When he left the room, Marlene's warning echoed in my mind. Once a plan is this far along, they don't postpone, they escalate. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I quietly packed a small bag, not enough to look like I was fleeing, but enough that if I needed to vanish quickly, I could. I hid it in the back of my car under a blanket. Then I sat alone in the living room, staring at the wall, replaying every moment of my marriage, every memory that now felt tainted. The man I thought loved me had been constructing my destruction long before I noticed the cracks. I was living beside a stranger wearing a mask. A stranger who believed he was weeks away from inheriting the rest of my life. Marlene told me that once she gathered enough evidence, she would bring it to authorities and begin the process of freezing assets and issuing emergency protective measures. But she needed time. Time to compile, time to verify, time to tighten the net around him so he couldn't slip away and disappear with the money. I didn't know if I had time. The cabin trip was only 10 days away. 10 days before the date marked final stage. 10 days before Daniel planned to stand over a cliff, pretending to reach for my hand as I slipped. I knew then that the countdown wasn't just on paper. It was real. And if I didn't find a way to survive these 10 days, no one would ever hear the truth. The days leading up to the cabin trip stretched like a wire pulled tight, every second vibrating with the tension of knowing I was living a script I was never meant to survive. Daniel became even more attentive, almost suffocatingly so, hovering round me with an eagerness that might have once felt flattering but now made my skin crawl. He cooked my meals, insisted on driving me everywhere, watched me with an intensity that felt less like devotion and more like surveillance. Every smile he gave me looked rehearsed. Every affectionate gesture seemed calculated, as though he were confirming I was still unsuspecting, still pliant, still exactly where he needed me to be. Meanwhile, Marlene was racing against the clock. Every evening, she sent me updates, quiet texts written in code, letting me know what she'd uncovered. She found financial trails Daniel tried to bury, offshore accounts he opened under aliases, communications between him and Elise that detailed timelines and financial projections for life after my death. She told me the evidence was enough to build a case, but not enough to arrest him immediately. Not until she secured one last document, a power of attorney form he had forged in my name, that would transfer full control of my father's remaining business shares into his hands. If she could retrieve it from the attorney he used, she could go straight to law enforcement. Without it, Daniel could argue ignorance or miscommunication, and he might be able to slip through the cracks. Time was running out. The night before we were supposed to leave for the cabin, Daniel suggested we pack lightly. He said the weather would be cold but not unbearable, that he already stocked the cabin with everything we'd need. The way he said stocked sent a chill up my spine. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to his breathing, counting each inhale, each exhale, imagining how easily they could stop mine. I thought of running, driving away in the middle of the night. But Marlene told me that disappearing without a legal strategy would give Daniel leverage. He could claim I was unstable, grieving, mentally unwell. He could seize control of the estate under the guise of protecting me. I needed the trap to close around him, not around me. The next morning, Daniel was cheerful, too cheerful. He loaded our bags into the car, humming to himself as though we were heading for a honeymoon rather than a planned execution. I checked my phone constantly, waiting for a message from Marlene telling me she had the last document. Nothing came. When we pulled out of the driveway, I felt an invisible hand tighten around my throat. The cabin was 2 hours away, nestled deep in the hills, one of those picturesque places realtors advertise as perfect isolation. When we arrived, the isolation felt murderous. The cabin sat alone on a ridge overlooking a rocky drop, the kind of view people would describe as breathtaking, except all I could think about was how easy it would be for someone to fall. Daniel unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and smiled at me with that gentle warmth he performed so well. I forced myself to smile back. Inside, everything looked perfect. Fireplace ready to be lit, wine chilling on the table, blankets folded neatly. It was a scene designed to disarm, to relax, to distract. My phone buzzed once. A message from Marlene. Almost there. Keep him calm. My stomach twisted. Daniel poured 2 glasses of wine, offering one to me. I hesitated only a second before taking it. I didn't drink. I simply wrapped my fingers around the glass and pretended to sip. He watched me closely, too closely. I realized then that part of his plan probably involved making me drunk. Easier to stumble, easier to slip off a cliff, easier to fall asleep and not wake up. I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door and steadying my breath as I stared at my reflection. I looked calm, controlled, not like someone who was minutes, maybe seconds, away from the moment everything might collapse. Another message buzzed on my phone. Got it? Police notified. Stall him. My hand shook. Stall him? How? He had already started pacing outside the bathroom door, asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, if I wanted to sit outside on the deck and look at the sunset. Sunset, the perfect backdrop for a perfect accident. I opened the door, forcing a smile and telling him I just needed a moment. He relaxed instantly, the warmth returning to his face, as if he believed everything was still going according to plan. We stepped onto the deck together. The air was cold, sharp, biting the inside of my lungs. The sun hovered low, painting the landscape in golds and reds, turning the cliffside into something deceptively beautiful. Daniel stood behind me, hands on the railing, his posture too casual, too practiced. I kept my phone in my pocket, waiting for another vibration. He stepped closer, his hand brushing my shoulder. My heart slammed against my ribs. He said something softly, something meant to sound affectionate, but all I heard was the intent beneath it. He moved beside me, positioning himself as though he were about to lean forward with me over the railing. I felt him shift his weight. I felt his hand slide toward my back. My phone vibrated again. We're close. Daniel made his move. It was subtle at first, a faint push meant to test my balance, to see if I would wobble, but I had anticipated it. I tightened my grip on the railing and turned to him as if startled. He froze, his expression a mask of concern, but behind it, for the first time, I saw a flicker of frustration. He wasn't getting the reaction he expected. He stepped closer again, insisting he just wanted to hold me, to comfort me, but his hand hovered too close to the small of my back. I stepped away, pretending to shiver, pretending I needed my jacket from inside. He followed. He couldn't let me out of sight now. Inside the cabin, the tension thickened, stretched thin as glass. He reached for my arm. I pulled away lightly, acting as though I didn't notice. My phone vibrated again. One word. Now. And before I could react, before I could move toward the door, headlights cut through the window, sweeping across the walls like a spotlight. Tires crunched gravel. Daniel stiffened. Someone knocked hard on the front door. The sound echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. The mask slid off Daniel's face. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw what he looked like without the performance. And the look he gave me wasn't love. It wasn't concern. It wasn't even fear. It was rage at a plan collapsing before his eyes. Astra Sky woke up in the hospital with the kind of pain that doesn't sit in one place but spreads through every nerve like a warning signal from my own body telling me that something irreversible has happened. The room was dim, the curtain half closed, the air thick with disinfectant. And for a few seconds I didn't understand why my wrists felt heavy until I saw the bruises forming around them from where someone had grabbed me during the fall. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't clumsiness. It wasn't stress. Daniel had pushed me. My husband, the man who had once brought me soup when I had a cold, who had read drafts of my thesis, who had kissed my forehead when he thought I was asleep, had tried to erase me. And the worst part was that deep down I wasn't even surprised. Shocked. Yes. Terrified, absolutely, but not surprised, because the truth had been circling me for months, brushing my skin like a cold wind I kept ignoring. A nurse entered the room, saw I was awake, and immediately called for the doctor. But behind her shoulder I saw a figure I didn't expect. Michael, my father's attorney. His presence was the closest thing to safety I had felt in months. And when he stepped closer, he whispered that the police were involved, that the doctors had recorded all injuries, that Daniel wasn't allowed in the hospital. I didn't know whether to cry or breathe or scream, so I did none of that. I just lay there letting reality settle like dust. What he told me next felt like someone had lifted the entire building and dropped it on my chest. My father had anticipated something like this. Not specifically Daniel, not specifically violence, but betrayal. Days before he died, he met with Michael and changed his will again, adding a private clause that no one, not even I, knew about. My inheritance, every account, every property, every share had been placed in a trust that required not only my signature but a psychological evaluation confirming I wasn't under duress or manipulation. The inheritance was locked unless I was proven safe. My father hadn't trusted my husband. My father, even while dying, had sensed something I had been too in love to see. I felt a kind of grief that didn't belong to the past day or week, but 2 years of moments I had wasted believing in someone capable of watching me fall down the stairs without hesitation. When the detectives arrived, their questions were sharp, clinical, almost surgical, and with every detail I described the lies, the documents, the secret accounts, the double life. My fears slowly turned into something else, something hotter, denser, heavier. Fury, not rage, not blind anger, but the quiet, deliberate kind that builds foundations rather than destroys them. Daniel wasn't careful. That was his downfall. He left messages, transactions, a trail of conversations with a woman named Alyana who wasn't just his mistress but his co-conspirator. They had been planning to move my assets into offshore accounts by using forged documents. The stair push was only the first step. They had discussed other ways to untie loose ends, a phrase that still makes my stomach twist. The police found more than enough to arrest him, and they did. But his reaction wasn't panic or denial. It was entitlement. As they handcuffed him, he shouted that everything would have been his anyway, that I was the one who ruined everything, that my father had been an idiot to keep me sheltered, that he had earned the fortune by pretending to love me for years. Pretending. That word didn't stab, it sliced clean. Months passed. Slow but not empty. My recovery wasn't only physical. I attended every hearing. I listened to every detail. I faced every document he forged, every lie he told, every message he sent. And with every step, I reclaimed parts of myself I hadn't realized he had taken. Eventually, the court convicted them both, Daniel and Alyana, on multiple charges including attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy, and identity manipulation. They would spend decades behind bars. But justice wasn't closure. It was simply the end of one nightmare and a beginning of something unfamiliar: freedom. I sold the house Daniel had remodeled to our taste, the one that never actually felt like mine. I moved into a smaller place with sunlight in every room because I wanted to remember every morning that darkness can be prevented. I donated a portion of the inheritance to a foundation supporting survivors of domestic manipulation because by then I understood that emotional violence hides better than physical violence. ever could. And one quiet evening, while sitting on my balcony, I opened the last letter my father had left for me, one I had been too scared to read before. In it, he wrote that love should feel like safety, not sacrifice. That people who truly love you don't study your vulnerabilities like a manual. And that strength isn't in enduring the wrong people, but in walking away before you lose yourself. I cried not because I was broken, but because for the first time I felt whole. My story didn't end with Daniel. It ended with me choosing myself, fully, without apology, without fear. I am not the woman he tried to erase. I am the woman who survived knowing he tried.